Have you ever wondered what happens to a child who grows up believing that nobody wants him? For 14-year-old Chris, home was supposed to be one place where he felt safe. But for as long as he could remember, home had never felt like home. Chris lived with his parents in a modest house in a busy Nigerian city. From the outside, their family looked ordinary. There was nothing about the house that suggested what happened behind its walls. But inside, Chris lived under rules that seemed to exist only to make his life miserable. His parents had never wanted a boy. They had hoped for a daughter. When Chris was born, they were disappointed. They never hid it from him. His father barely celebrated his birth. His mother rarely showed him affection. They gave him food when they felt hunger had dealt with him long enough, which was sometimes even over 2 days. And as Chris grew older, he began to understand something no child should ever have to understand. His parents didn't want him. Still, Chris tried to make them proud. He helped around the house. He kept his room clean. He tried to stay quiet. He did everything he could to avoid making them angry, but somehow nothing was ever good enough. If he woke up late, he was punished. If he forgot to wash a plate, he was punished. If he answered a question too slowly, he was shouted at. Sometimes he didn't even know what he'd done wrong. One morning, Chris was still asleep when his father stormed into his room. "Get up." Chris immediately opened his eyes. His father stood over him, already angry. Chris tried to sit up quickly, but he wasn't fast enough. His father grabbed him and dragged him out of bed. "How many times do I have to tell you?" Chris said nothing. He had learned that answering back only made things worse. His mother watched from the doorway. She didn't stop him. She simply turned around and walked away. That became Chris's reality. Day after day, week after week, year after year. And then, something happened that changed everything. Chris's mother became pregnant again. For the first time in years, the atmosphere inside the house changed. His parents were excited. They decorated the baby's room. They bought tiny clothes. They thought constantly about the child they were expecting. Chris watched from a distance. He had never seen his parents this happy, and secretly, he hoped that when the baby arrived, maybe things would finally change. Maybe they would love him too. Maybe having another child would make them realize that he was still their son. But when the baby was born, everything went horribly wrong. The child was a girl, exactly what his parents had always wanted, but she was born with severe complications, and despite the doctor's efforts, she died shortly after birth. Chris's parents were devastated. The house that had once been filled with excitement became silent. His mother barely spoke. His father stopped coming home early, and whenever Chris entered the room, their faces changed. At first, Chris didn't understand why. Then the blame started. "You should have been the one." Chris froze the first time he heard his mother say it. He stared at her, trying to understand what she meant, but she wouldn't explain. His father became even colder. The little patience they had for Chris disappeared completely. They started treating him as though his existence itself was an insult. Chris tried harder. He cleaned more. He spoke less. He stayed out of their way, but nothing worked. And there was something else that made Chris's childhood even worse. His parents had never sent him to school. Not once. From the time he was old enough to understand what school was, Chris watched other children leave their homes every morning in uniforms. He would stand behind the window, watching them carry school bags and walk toward their classrooms. Sometimes he would imagine himself walking beside them, learning, making friends, reading books, having a normal childhood. but his parents had already decided he didn't deserve that opportunity. They told him education was a waste of money. So while other children spent their mornings in classrooms, Chris stayed inside the house. He had never owned a school uniform. He had never sat inside a classroom. He had never had a teacher. He didn't even know what it felt like to raise his hand and answer a question. His entire education consisted of whatever he could teach himself from the few books and scraps of information he occasionally found around the house. Yet, Chris was curious. He wanted to understand everything. Whenever he found an old newspaper, he read it. Whenever he found a book, he studied it. He would ask questions whenever he had the chance. But there was nobody around him willing to nurture that curiosity. His parents only saw him as another mouth to feed. So instead, he spent his days doing chores, cooking, cleaning, fetching water, running errands, and whenever he made even the smallest mistake, they reminded him exactly how unwanted he was. Years passed. Chris grew taller, but his situation never changed. He had never been given the chance to discover what he was capable of. One night, he sat alone on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the children he watched every morning. He thought about school. He thought about the future. And for the first time, he asked himself a question. What if I leave? The thought scared him. He had nowhere to go. No money, no friends he could stay with. No idea what existed beyond the streets he knew. But staying felt even scarier. The next morning, Chris made a decision. Before we see what happens to Chris, if you're enjoying the story, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Nigerian stories like this. He was leaving. Before anyone woke up, he quietly opened a small bag. He packed 2 shirts, a pair of trousers, a few personal belongings, and the little money he had managed to save. He stood in the doorway of his room and looked back one last time. There were no tears. He had cried too many times already. Chris quietly opened the front door and walked outside. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what would happen to him. He only knew one thing. He couldn't stay there anymore. For the first time in 14 years, Chris was walking away from home, but he had no idea that the hardest part of his life was only beginning. Chris walked for hours. By midday, his feet hurt. The money he had brought barely bought him a small bottle of water and a piece of bread. He had imagined that leaving home would make him feel free. Instead, he felt lost. The city suddenly seemed much bigger than he remembered. Cars rushed past him. People hurried to their destinations. Nobody noticed the 14-year-old boy carrying a small bag with nowhere to go. As evening approached, Chris found the back of a small restaurant. There was a narrow space between the building and a wall where empty crates had been stacked. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hidden. That night, Chris slept on the cold ground. The noise from the restaurant continued long after midnight. He barely slept. The next morning, one of the workers discovered him. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Chris quickly stood up. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'll leave." The worker stared at him. For a moment, he seemed to realize that Chris was only a child, but eventually, he told him he couldn't stay there. Chris nodded. He picked up his bag and walked away. For the next few days, he moved from place to place. Sometimes he found nowhere dry to sleep. Sometimes he didn't. Then he discovered a secondary school. Behind the school buildings, there was a quiet area where very few people passed after classes ended. Chris decided to stay there. He would wait until the students went home. Then he would settle into a sheltered corner behind one of the classroom blocks. It wasn't home, but at least nobody shouted at him. At least nobody told him he was unwanted. One evening, Chris sat behind the school with his knees pulled close to his chest. He had been trying not to cry, but after several days without a proper meal, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He buried his face in his arms. He didn't hear the footsteps approaching. Are you alright? Chris looked up. Standing a few feet away was a woman carrying a handbag. She wore the clothes of a teacher. Her name was Mrs. Kainkumi. She had stayed late after marking papers. As she walked towards the school gate, she had heard someone crying. Now she looked at Chris with genuine concern. Why are you here? Chris said nothing. Are your parents looking for you? Still, nothing. Mrs. Kainkumi didn't pressure him. She simply sat on a nearby bench. You don't have to tell me everything, she said, but you shouldn't be sleeping behind a school. Something about her voice made Chris feel safe. For the first time since leaving home, he began to talk. He told her about the shouting, the insults, the way his parents made him feel unwanted. But Chris left one thing out. He never told her that his parents were still alive. He was terrified that if she found them, she would send him back. He told her he had nowhere to go. Mrs. Kainkumi listened quietly. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment. Then she stood up. Come with me. Chris hesitated. I won't hurt you, she said. I just want you to have a proper meal. Chris looked at her. Then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he trusted her. Mrs. Kainkumi took him home. Her husband was surprised when she arrived with a teenage boy, but after hearing Chris's story, he said nothing against helping him. They gave Chris food, real food, hot food. Chris ate slowly at first, then faster. Mrs. Kainkumi pretended not to notice the tears in his eyes. That night, they gave him clean clothes. They prepared a bed. Chris lay down. The mattress felt softer than anything he had slept on in days. Before falling asleep, he whispered something he hadn't said in years. Thank you. Mrs. Kainkumi and her husband had been trying to have a child for many years. After countless disappointments, they had eventually accepted that they might never become parents. Recently, they had begun discussing adoption, but there was one problem. They knew nothing about Chrissy's family. The next morning, Mrs. Kainkumi asked gently, Do you have any relatives? Chris looked down. He was afraid that if she found his parents, they would force him to return. So he lied. I'm an orphan. Mrs. Kainkumi studied his face. Then she nodded slowly. She didn't know the truth, and Chris wasn't ready to tell it. Weeks turned into months. Mrs. Kainkumi enrolled Chris in school. On his first day, he was terrified. He had never sat in a classroom before. He worried that everyone would know. He worried that he would be laughed at. But something surprising happened. Chris learned very quickly. Within weeks, his teachers noticed. He remembered lessons after hearing them once. He solved problems other students struggled with. He read every book he could find. The boy who had never been given an education turned out to be extraordinarily intelligent. Mrs. Kainkumi couldn't hide her pride. She watched him grow more confident every day. For the first time, Chris began to imagine a future. Years passed. Chris finished secondary school with outstanding results. His teachers helped him apply for scholarships. Eventually, he received an offer from a major university abroad. Mrs. Kainkumi cried when she read the letter. Chris did too. The boy who had once slept behind a school was leaving the country to study medicine. University wasn't easy. Chris worked harder than anyone. He remembered every opportunity he had almost lost. Years later, he graduated as a doctor. He returned home, but not as the frightened boy who had run away, as a skilled physician working at a respected hospital. One afternoon, Chris was called to assist with an emergency patient. He entered the examination room and froze. The man on the hospital bed was his father. Beside him sat his mother. For several seconds, nobody spoke. His mother covered her mouth. His father stared at him in disbelief. Chris? The name sounded strange after so many years. Chris took a deep breath. Then he looked at the patient's chart. His father was seriously ill. The disease had a high fatality rate if left untreated. His parents looked terrified. Perhaps they expected him to walk away. Perhaps they believed they deserved it. Instead, Chris pulled up a chair. "Please sit down," he said calmly. His mother began to cry. After everything we did, Chris didn't answer. He asked questions. He examined his father. He ordered tests. Then he explained the treatment. For days, Chris remained part of the medical team caring for him. He never raised his voice. He never mentioned the past. He simply did his job. Eventually, his father's condition improved. The day he was discharged, both of Chris's parents asked to speak with him. His father looked older than Chris remembered. His mother couldn't stop crying. "We were wrong," his father said. "We treated you horribly." His mother stepped forward. "I'm sorry." Chris listened quietly. Years of memories passed through his mind. The shouting, the loneliness, the nights he wondered why nobody loved him. Then he looked at them. "I forgive you." His mother began crying harder, but Chris continued. "Forgiving you doesn't mean pretending it never happened." His parents lowered their eyes. "I helped you because you're my patient," Chris said, "and because I don't want to carry hatred anymore." His father nodded slowly. Chris stood. "I hope you both live well." Then he returned toward the door. His mother called his name one last time. Chris paused. He looked back. There was no anger in his face anymore, only peace. Then he walked away. Chris returned to the life he had built, a life that began because one kind teacher noticed a frightened boy crying behind a school. Mrs. Kaikumi hadn't given him money. She hadn't promised him success. She simply gave him something he had never received before, a chance. And sometimes, one chance is all a person needs to discover who they were always meant to become.